Let's get this sports podcast party started, all right?
The JAYREELZ podcast.
I'm elated and honored to welcome in a new partnership here on the podcast. Are you familiar with Olipop Soda? If you're not, well, listen up. I haven't been a soda drinker for quite some time. But when I discovered Olipop and what they're all about, I was all in. Not only is it a prebiotic soda that's good for your gut, it's non-GMO, organic, with ingredients that you can actually read. That's right, no 12 or 14 letter words that you can't pronounce. And are you worried about the dreaded high fructose corn syrup? Not here, as there's very little sugar, only 4 grams per serving. And the flavors, you have vintage cola, orange squeeze, my favorite, tropical punch, banana cream, what? Plus the classics such as root beer, ginger ale, lemon lime, which has a better taste. What? How can I forget about the taste? Crisp, refreshing, without feeling bloated afterward than the usual brands that you're familiar with. Right now you can get 15% off at checkout when you use the code SODALOVE, and I'll get a percentage of that based on your purchase. It's a win-win for you and I. Please go to drinkolipop.com and get 15% off by using the code SODALOVE at checkout. Thanks to the good people at Olipop, and an early thank you for shopping at drinkolipop.com. What is happening, my good people? Greetings. How are you? How's it going? How's everybody doing out there? What is the latest and greatest? Hope everybody's doing well, feeling fantastic, in excellent spirits. The Ides of March are here. The clocks have been moved forward. Daylight extends past 7 p.m. The weather has been seasonable the past few days here in the Northeast. Spring is just 5 days away from today. What could be better than that? Well, another podcast with yours truly, unpacking all that's happening in the world of sports, as this is the JAYREELZ podcast with your host, JAYREELZ. For my first timers, welcome aboard. And for those who've been banging with me going back to the very beginning, somewhere in the middle, or even as early as this past Monday, I welcome you guys and gals back. And yes, it has been a wild and crazy past few days in sports, highlighted by none other than the Shield, the impenetrable one, as I like to say. And we understand over the last few years with free agency, especially in the NFL and NBA, where when the window opens, generally for the NBA, it's July 1st. Same for the NHL for that matter. But in particular, when it comes to basketball and then with football, where that window of questionable tampering, quote unquote, if you will, because when we look at the NFL new season beginning yesterday, where in essence it happened on Monday, because that's when everything exploded with all these different signings, which was highlighted by Kirk Cousins, because that was the first one that popped up on my news feed. And when I saw that Kirk Cousins signed with the Atlanta Falcons, 4 years, $180 million with $100 million of that guaranteed, it made me think, boy, would I love to be a 14-year-old trying to make my way through high school to get my arm ready to see if I could possibly get a scholarship and then go to some university, go there for 3 years at least, maybe even 4, and then come out of that with an opportunity to be drafted into the NFL and then take my chances from there. And as a young boy wanting to be a baseball player, and again, growing up in the 70s and even 80s, there's no way that I would have had anything close to the amount of money that these players are getting here in 2024. But for Kirk Cousins, who, as we all know, been in the league for a long time, drafted by the Washington Redskins at the time, moved on to Minnesota, got the big payday there, and then now at 36 years of age, coming off an Achilles injury, he gets top dollar more than anything that you would probably even ever think of, considering that he does have a decent resume and has put up big numbers. Mind you, in big games, he's folded like a cheap suit. But for him to get to this stage of his football life, the last big payday, and if anybody were to ask me prior to Monday how much Kirk Cousins would have gotten on the market, I said he probably would have got at least 3 years, maybe $120 million. And who knows what the signing bonus or how much guaranteed he would have gotten. But that's what I would have looked at if I'm an organization to buy in, to try to get that guy on my team and to have him signed on the dotted line to the point where, although that still may be exorbitant considering his age and the injury that he's coming off from, that even at $120 million, that may be a lot, but we get it. $40 million a year, that's the going rate for a quarterback, at least a Good quarterback. We're not talking about elite. We're not talking about great, but good. And Kirk Cousins does fall into that category where he is a good quarterback. But boy, $45 million a year when you break it down and $100 million guaranteed. Boy, only in America could you get something like that. And kudos to his agent, kudos to Kirk Cousins for that matter as well. Because he came in at the right opportunity knowing that the Falcons, desperate for a quarterback, they did not want to go the route of a trade and then have to pay, let's say, a guy like Justin Fields, who's from the Atlanta area. So they figured that let's just go with a guy who is a veteran, a guy who knows his way around the league and who has played for a long time, even though he hasn't won a big game other than New Orleans during the wild card, what was it? The next to last year of Drew Brees' career as the Saint quarterback. And that's going back, 2019, I believe? And for him to not really come up big in any type of primetime games during the regular season or even the postseason for that matter. And the Falcons said, the hell with it. We need a quarterback. We don't care what he's done in the past. It's about what he does now and in the future with the weapons that he's going to have on that offense, whether it is Bijan Robinson at running back or Kyle Pitts as your tight end, Drake London as your wide receiver. Doesn't matter. As long as you have a guy like Cousins who is capable, who does have talent, and has shown that he has had success in this league, but that's okay. We'll just fork over $180 million if you're Arthur Blank, the owner of the Falcons, and we'll just see where it goes from there. And do I even need to get into him being overpaid or him not deserving that type of contract? Whomever his agent is, obviously got him top dollar. And one more time, that's the going rate. You could laugh at it. You could scoff at it. You could be disgusted. You could be just, these exorbitant contracts, what's going on? That's just how it is. So I can bitch and moan myself to discuss whether or not he deserves it or whether or not it's too much. Like I told you, I would have gone the route of Justin Fields, even though you'd still have to pay him. But if you listen to the podcast going back a week ago, I said give him a friendly contract along the lines of 3 years. It's an extension because he's going into the final year now of his rookie contract. 3 years, $100 million, give him 33 a year. You want to give him 50 of that million guaranteed, and away you go. But who am I? I'm far from an NFL GM. I'm far from a front office guy. But instead of going with potential, youth, and even though has not really delivered consistently in the early part of his NFL career, that being Justin Fields, as opposed to going with that veteran guy who, yes, has a resume, been in the league a long time, everything that I just mentioned, but has not had success on a level where he's a guy that's going to take you to the promised land. So that's where the Falcons go, and to me, that was the biggest signing of all, and we have a ton to go through. I get it with the running backs. If you're a Giant fan, you're disgusted at Saquon Barkley, considering that he goes down the turnpike 90 miles to play in Philadelphia with the Eagles, and then a lot of people think that that was a huge signing because that may put Jalen Hurts, the coach Nick Sirianni, back into the front of the NFL, or I should say the NFC pecking order when it comes to how this team is going to maybe get back to its Super Bowl ways of now 2 seasons ago. And with Jalen Hurts, who went down the stretch of that regular season last year, even with that great start, 10-1 and losing 6 of the last 7, to have a guy in his backfield that could be dynamic and could maybe even take some of the load off of him to try to run the ball and focus squarely on maybe staying in that pocket and having to run when he needs to. But Barkley, who got 3 years, $37.5 million, which obviously does not sound like a lot when you look at the NFL climate, but with running backs, and we talked about this a couple weeks ago, what they're going to be worth, what they're going to be paid is going to be a far cry from what the quarterback or the left tackle or even the wide receiver is going to get, because you can look at Calvin Ridley and what he got. A guy who was suspended for a year because of gambling, came back in Jacksonville for a year, and he goes to Tennessee and he signs a 4-year, $92 million deal. But for Barkley, him leaving, and you had that whole scenario with Tiki Barber saying that he's dead to us as a Giant organization or being part of the Giant family and dead to me, considering that he moved now to the city of brotherly love, and then Barkley comes back with the hater comment, and that's something that I'm not going to unpack. I just bring that up because that's going to add a lot of juice and a lot of just craziness when the Eagles come to MetLife whenever that's going to be, sometime in the fall. So you're going to have that dynamic and that part of the rivalry, which could be heightened, having Barkley now in green and white. But when we look at what the Eagles have done, considering that there has been some turnover there, and I'll get to Derrick Henry in a minute because I know he's also another top guy that found greener pastures, not necessarily with money because he only got 2 years for $16 million, but where he ended up, which I'm sure a lot of you people know by now. But Philadelphia has also been a big player here with a lot that's gone on with them over the last couple of days. I know they signed a guard, Landon Dickerson, which may not sound like a lot, but only because they need some offensive line help considering Jason Kelce has retired. We understand what happened there with Fletcher Cox. He also retired as well. And the Eagles, who are trying to see if they can revamp and get themselves back in the mix as far as being one of those top teams in the NFC. And you would think that they're still going to be that, even with some of the subtractions there when it comes to retired players, and even with the likes of now Saquon Barkley coming in, being that addition. But for Philadelphia and a lot of the teams there, even in the division other than the Dallas Cowboys, of course, Washington brings in a guy like Austin Eckler, which was also a nice move. And I understand they're not going to make any type of big moves here because they're going to see what they could do as far as getting a quarterback. And a lot of people think it's going to be Drake May in the draft, or it could be even Jaden Daniels for that matter. But that we'll have to wait and see. But Philadelphia, you know that they're going to be a team that is going to do whatever it is that they can to get themselves back amongst the likes of even a team in their own division, whether it's the Cowboys or the 49ers, maybe even Atlanta now, because Atlanta's going to be a playoff team with this move here with Cousins, provided that he stays healthy, which is going to be huge for the new coach that's in tow there in a one, Raheem Morris. So you have that. Now let me pivot to go to Derrick Henry because he signed a 2-year deal with the Ravens. And to me, that is a huge move. That is a final piece to the puzzle move. And I get it that this offense, which has been tailored around Lamar Jackson, more so last year, throwing and running as we know, but now you have a guy in their backfield that could really pound the rock. You don't have to put more pressure on Lamar Jackson to run. And I get it that he's been a guy that's want to stay in the pocket first before he takes off and runs as he did early on in his career. But now Henry is a guy, and Todd Monken, who was awful in that AFC Championship game, knows that he has to give the rock to Derrick Henry in big spots, especially when you're getting deep into the regular season and obviously into the postseason. But for Henry, a guy that the last thing that he needs to have on his resume, and not to say that a running back has to be defined by Super Bowls, but you know he's brought in to get him and his team to a Super Bowl and win. That's all there is to it. So you have to wonder whether or not this guy is going to be that final piece to bring Lamar and company to a Super Bowl and to win it. Anything short of that is going to be a disappointment. And Henry, it's all a matter of how much he has left in the tank. He is 30 years of age. He does have a lot of tread that's been worn on those tires. And I think, not that he has anything to prove to the NFL or even to himself for that matter, but he does have a lot to prove because he's a guy that has a new team. He's been on Tennessee throughout the course of his career. He's been brought there to do one thing and one thing only. Not only, of course, rush the ball, but to get his team to a Super Bowl. So his workload is going to be more defined by what he's going to do in January, maybe February, as opposed to September through early January. That's how I look at that signing. It's almost as if you're signing a pitcher, a starting pitcher, to lead your team in October as opposed to the regular season. That's what this signing means to me when I look at it. And who knows? Is Henry going to be that guy that obviously is not going to carry 300 plus throughout the course of the year? I'm sure they're going to try to give him anywhere between 18 to 22 carries per game. But wear and tear, injuries, 30 years of age, we understand that that's the start of the decline for the running back. And I think he's going to be energized. I think he's going to be rejuvenated to get to this Raven team to show that, yes, I'm going to be the guy that's going to carry this team to a Super Bowl and finally get Lamar and company and even this recent vintage Raven team to that Super Bowl that's been eluding them since Jackson has got 2 MVPs on his mantle over the last 5 years. And what has that amounted to? No Super Bowl appearances. So those are big signings. Now, if I'm going to go through all these transactions, people, that's a podcast unto itself. I'm only going to go through the big ones at best. Am I going to go through the Jameis Winston going to Cleveland to back up Deshaun Watson? I mean, I'm bringing it up now. Or even Gardner Minshew going to the Vegas Raiders. All right, I'm bringing it up now. But is that going to be impactful? Obviously not. But I'm going to go through some of the other big signings and even trades for that matter, because I know the Giants traded for Brian Burns, Carolina. Speaking of which, even though Saquon left to go to Philadelphia, but they do bring in Devin Singletary, the former Texan as well as Buffalo Bill, to pretty much fill in his role. They also bring in John Runyon Jr. to be part of that offensive line from Green Bay. And then they traded for Burns and they gave him $150 million, $87 million guaranteed. So that's a huge signing there for the Giants to go along with Kayvon Thibodeau to kind of bookend each other there on that defensive line to get some pressure on the quarterback. You also had the Steelers sign Patrick Queen, the linebacker of the Ravens. I don't even know how I felt about that once I saw that, because I have never been a Patrick Queen guy. To me, yes, he's fast as lightning, but I always thought he was a little bit light in the ass for a linebacker. But he had 2 big years these last couple of years, and now he goes to Pittsburgh. So that's a guy I'm going to have to root for big time to go along with TJ Watt, to go along with Alex Highsmith. That was a big signing. They didn't want to go the veteran route, as you've seen over the last couple of years, whether it was a guy like Quan Alexander who blew out his Achilles, guys of those natures, Cole Holcomb, etc. So you bring in Queen, who knows the division well. So to me, that was a surprise signing by Pittsburgh. They also traded Deontay Johnson to Carolina for a cornerback in a one, Dante Jackson. So the salaries match in that trade. There was also some draft picks thrown around as well. The backup quarterback there for a long time, Mason Rudolph, he signs with Tennessee for 1 year. So you have to wonder, it's going to be, as we all know, Russell Wilson and then Kenny Pickett's going to be your backup. I'm sure there's going to be a third stringer there at some point. Maybe they draft a guy here in this draft, or maybe pick up somebody on the scrap heap. That we'll have to wait and see. You also had Joe Mixon, the former Cincinnati Bengal. He gets traded to the Houston Texans, and in essence, they signed Zach Moss. To me, Mixon was a good guy in that offense, but was he a guy that was going to be impactful? Was he a guy that, although had his moments there in Cincinnati, but because he was traded, and Zach Moss, to me, that's not really a big loss if you ask me. It's not as if you're losing one of the top running backs. Mixon was not classified as that. He was probably a second tier somewhere in that regard, but a guy that was a focal point of the offense, but wasn't a key focal point when you look at how the league is being played at this current moment with the passing game. Obviously, having a guy like Jamar Chase, and now with T. Higgins going on the record requesting a trade in his own right. Who knows what's going to happen there? They do have Tyler Boyd, who's been a longtime fixture there in Cincinnati, but not having that other guy, T. Higgins, who's been very successful in that offense in Cincinnati. So you have to wonder whether or not they're going to grant him that request, or they're going to try to keep him, extend his contract, because that's what it seems to be. There was an impasse there as far as Higgins wanting to get top dollar or anything close to that. But remember, they're going to have to sign Jamar Chase at some point, and he's going to command top dollar. If Calvin Ridley's getting $92 million, you know Jamar Chase is going to get something close, if not more than that. So that's something to keep an eye on there if you're the Bengals. Then you had Carolina signing the guard there, Robert Hunt from Miami. And Miami's had a lot of big losses here, whether it was guys that they cut right before this free agency period, Xavier Howard, even Emmanuel Ogbah. You have Hunt, who's going to be gone. You've had other players. I have to take a look here because I do have a long list. Christian Wilkins goes to the Raiders as well. Guy who was a defensive tackle there for the Dolphins. So now he goes out west to get the big payday. You also have, let's see, as I'm looking through here, guys who have left. Tony Pollard goes to Tennessee. DeAndre Swift, formerly of the Eagles, goes to the Bears. Michael Pittman stays in Indianapolis with a, what did he get? 3 for $71 million. Kenny Moore, the defensive back, stays in Indianapolis. Xavier McKinney, Giants, who goes to Green Bay. I know Green Bay was also in the news with Josh Jacobs, as he was a guy that signed there with the Packers, younger than Aaron Jones, who they cut. Jones has not been signed as of yet, so who knows what's going to happen with him. I know the Jets were able to get John Simpson and Tyrod Taylor, also Javon Kinlaw, but in the process they lose a guy like Bryce Huff, who I believe went to Philadelphia. Now that I think about it, let me double check that. But Bryce Huff, who had a big year there with the Jets this past year and weren't able to re-sign him. And Bryce Huff, I believe, did go down to Philadelphia. That was the one guy I wanted to mention earlier when we talked about what the Eagles have done here over the course of the last few days here. And yes, he did sign with the Eagles, so that's a big plus for them, considering that they did not have that pass rush presence from last year or from 2 years ago when they had Hassan Reddick, who had a big year. Javon Hargrave, he went to San Francisco. And Fletcher Cox did not have the same year that he'd had last year as the previous year. So for Philadelphia, that was a big signing for them. And again, I'm not going to go through all of the permutations and all the players that have been signed here, because I'll be here forever with that. I'm looking to see what else I could bring up here. John Simpson, we talked about. He was formerly of the Ravens. He signed with the Jets, as they need offensive help in the worst way as far as the offensive line goes. I thought a big signing there in Houston was Danielle Hunter, the former Minnesota Viking, to go with DeMeco Ryans, the first-year coach, former defensive coordinator, and to also combine him with Will Anderson. Now, they did lose Jonathan Grenard, who had, 14 sacks, I believe, last year, or somewhere in that vicinity, 12 to 14. He goes to Minnesota. So that was pretty much a swap there between Grenard, who had 12 and a half sacks last year, and Danielle Hunter. I would think I'd like to have Hunter more so than Grenard, although he did have a big year in Houston. So that you can look as a wash. But other than that, I understand as a matter of fact, Aaron Jones did go to the Vikings, now that I look at the list here. So even though he was cut, he did sign there with the Vikings. So my apologies for not picking that up earlier, as well as Sam Darnold. He goes to Minnesota with Cousins out, so looks like he may be your starting quarterback there in Minnesota unless something happens here over the course of these next few weeks and maybe even when it comes to the draft. And that, in a big giant nutshell, is what you have there with the NFL. So kudos to this opening free agent period. I know that you still have a few other players that haven't been signed, and you have to wonder whether or not that they're going to whether sign big paydays or smaller paydays. That we'll have to wait and see. But no surprise, the NFL is always going to be front and center when it comes to the news cycle. And that's why I kicked off the podcast with this, because how could you not, A, and B, I had to bring up Kirk Cousins because that was one that, I don't want to say shocked the world, but it certainly shocked me and a lot of people who have podcasts or radio hosts, the TV talking heads, etc. That was one that certainly raised a bunch of eyebrows, so I had to lead with that. And then obviously all the players that have been moving here over the last several days, and I'm sure there's going to be more movement here over the course of the next few days leading into next week before we get that quiet period later in the month, and then we'll have to start it up all over again about a couple weeks before the draft, pro days, whose stock is rising, whose stock has dropped, etc. And even though it has been a 12-month news cycle when it comes to the NFL, but right now it is hot, it is fast, it is furious, it is heavy, and therefore that's why I started off the podcast with the NFL. Now I'm going to pivot that to Major League Baseball as I put on my cleats and get into the batter's box, because to me it ties in. The NFL, as we all know, I started off impenetrable, the Shield, etc., where baseball, once upon a time, was the sport in this country. When we look at the 20th century and the history, tradition of what was once known as America's pastime, it might as well be called America's past tense. Because when we see the lay of the land in Major League Baseball, and when we look at how free agency, although even in its best year, does not have the same flavor of the NFL or even the NBA for that matter. And for baseball to have fallen off a cliff And I get it, they're trying to resurrect it with the rule changes and speeding up the game, etc. Okay, fine. But here's the contrast between the NFL, who right now is by far the biggest sport in this country, as we know, and that's not breaking any news, to where baseball, which held that perch for, it seemed, forever, has fallen down the pecking order to the point where you could argue it may be fourth or fifth when it comes to sports in this country. NFL, NBA, college football. There may even be some factions where NASCAR, Formula One is even bigger than baseball. That I beg to differ, but my whole point in this soliloquy here is that with free agency and baseball, and there's a situation right now in the Bronx, or in this case in Tampa with the Yankees, and their reigning Cy Young Award winner, Gerrit Cole, who felt discomfort in his elbow on Monday, flew out to LA to see one of the top specialists when it comes to Tommy John surgery and the ulnar collateral ligament in the elbow, which is not necessarily a death sentence, but when you have a pitcher of that ilk and is 33 years of age, and by any means his career is far from over. But there is a possibility that even though with the recent report that his elbow seems to be sound, there is no ligament damage, or at least a tear of that UCL ligament. And even though the Yankees, they want to proceed with caution and get another examination by one of the top guys in the country, and him being in LA now, and I would think being examined as I'm speaking into this microphone at this very moment. But for whatever the reason, if that MRI or that CT scan, which has already taken place with the Yankee physicians, now to get this even a level higher, if this by any means comes back anything less than clean, or maybe discovers a tear or something that the Yankees may not have to look at, I should say, where he's this close to tearing it, because as it is right now, he's missing opening day, and the reports are that he's going to miss a month or two. But if this visit to LA comes back anything less than stellar, to where he may have to go under the knife, and now as I finally tie this all into one big knot, there were two pitchers out there that have not been signed, and currently as I look at the date, it is March 14th. That being Blake Snell and Jordan Montgomery. Two guys that one won an NL Cy Young Award last year in Snell, and the other was a former Yankee who won a World Series with the Texas Rangers. How any of these guys aren't signed as of this very moment is flabbergasting. And here we are 2 weeks away from the start of the regular season, where these guys, I'm sure they've been working out, and I'm sure that they've been ramping up whatever their schedules are to try to prepare themselves to be signed on the dotted line for a regular season somewhere in some city for some organization. But because we are nowhere near that, and even with the Yankees right now, waited with bated breath to see whether or not Cole is going to either be done for the year or is going to come back by the All-Star break or whatever it may be. You would think that they're probably working the phones to see whether or not they could bring one of these two guys in the fold, because if the Yankees do not have Cole for an entire year, forget about a World Series, or if they have him for half the year, maybe they could bring in a reinforcement to sign a guy that could be, let's say, 1 year at $30 million with an opt-out or whatever it may be, whether it is Snell or Montgomery, because they cannot make a trade, or they could make a trade, I should say, but the one guy that was on their radar was Dylan Cease of the Chicago White Sox, and even though they didn't want to give up their outfield prospect Spencer Jones, as reported, where the White Sox were asking for Jones in return for Dylan Cease, who's only making only $8 million a year. But because they nixed that trade and the Padres were able to snag him, and even though the details have not been reported as to who's coming back from San Diego to Chicago, but for the Yankees now, not to say that they're over a barrel, but they may not have a choice but to sign either Snell or Montgomery, because of the likelihood that Cole's going to be out for at least a couple of months and maybe for the whole year. There's big aspirations for this team to get back to a World Series, bringing in Juan Soto, having the lineup that they have, and without having that anchor in their pitching rotation, you can pretty much forget it. And yes, people can argue, well, what about the Arizona Diamondbacks making the World Series? Or even the Texas Rangers. They didn't have Max Scherzer. They didn't have Jacob deGrom. And what happened to them? All right, if that's going to be your argument, 100% understood. But if you're the Yankees, it's World Series win or bust. It's not, let's win a division and maybe win a round or two. Or, oh, let's try to sneak in as a wild card and let's see where the chips fall when they may. There's a standard on 161st and River Avenue. And if they're not going to have that guy that's going to anchor their rotation, then chances are they may not make it to October, or at least deep into October, and win a championship that they haven't done in 15 years. And that's my whole point. I understand it may have been a little, what's the word, circuitous, or I may have gone a little bit of a detour, but it all does tie in to everything that I mentioned when it comes to the NFL, how swift and maybe even questionable when it comes to some tampering, because that's one thing I didn't mention. The Eagles right now, or at least with the Giants, they're going to investigate whether or not there was tampering involved with Saquon Barkley. But for Major League Baseball to have this drawn out to be a couple of weeks before the start of the regular season and to have two pitchers, it's not as if you have two so-so guys or two journeyman pitchers or whatever. And even if that was the case, all right, you could argue that. But you have two guys that could certainly be either at the top or near the top of anybody's rotation in Major League Baseball, and they don't even have a job. We could talk about Scott Boras. We could get into all that, which I've discussed in the past, and I don't want to waste any more time or breath with that. But there is a problem here with baseball and so many factions and free agency, although it's a minor one. You would think, because it's about what happens on the field, it's about what happens between the white lines. I understand that. But how is it that the NFL free agency, which has gotten off to a flying start here in its first couple of days before the curtain was even raised on their new season, and baseball has two big-time free agents that still haven't been signed, when NFL free agency, not to say it's over because there's still some fringe guys that haven't signed, but for all intents and purposes, a lot of the big guys have already inked their deals and have been official. How does that happen? I tell you, just a disgrace. It's a now-not disgrace how baseball has just fallen off the face of the earth. Not only when it comes to the sport and when it comes to the interest of Major League Baseball, but even free agency they screw up. And I understand with agents and with certain things that may have been put in place and could have been a lot better controlled, but haven't, because there's no salary cap. Because anyway, let me not go there. Let me digress, because I'm just going to end up babbling for another 20 minutes just talking about this, because as a lifelong baseball fan that I am, it's just very frustrating to stomach to know that something like this is taking place. And anyway, as I move on, let me stick with baseball, because there are a couple other things to bring up here. I know that the Brewers, Devin Williams, their closer, and we understand that Corbin Burns is now in Baltimore and Brandon Woodruff is going to be out for the year with a shoulder. And the Brewers, with their bullpen, especially with their closer, now is going to be out for 3 months with 2 stress fractures in his back. Over-unders are going to take place here soon, and I don't know what their over-under number is going to be, but right now I'm looking at that team as an under. Because when you look at their lineup, they don't have a guy that's going to jump off the page. Christian Yelich is a far cry from what he once was a few years ago as an MVP player. And then you have their rotation, which is in shambles. Their bullpen, especially the back end, same deal there. It looks like it's going to be a long season there in Milwaukee. And of course, you had Craig Counsell go down the interstate from Wisconsin to Illinois to be on the north side of Chicago to be the Cubs manager. So yeah, it is not looking good if you're a Brewer fan, if you ask me. And one more time, with the season starting in a couple of weeks, you know that I'm going to be ecstatic. Right now, I'm starting to get in baseball mode, people. So that's something I'm sure who have listened to me over the years, you know, baseball is my thing. And even though as unpopular as it may be in this day and age, and especially with the younger folk, but you know I'm going to be pumped up come the 28th in 2 weeks to get ready for baseball season, have a baseball preview, etc. You know I'll have you all covered with that, over-unders, World Series predictions, and even my Met preview, which who knows what that's going to look like. But for Major League Baseball and having this whole scenario with the Yankees, with Cole, with maybe needing a starting pitcher, with two guys out there, that was something I had to bring to the forefront to tie in with the NFL before I talk about what's happening on the hardwood and on the ice. And one last thing too, speaking of which, if the Yankees are not going to have Cole, and I know I said this before, but one other time, this will be just a devastating blow. Because you're going to have a guy that, he's a workhorse. 100%. And you know that if he has to get Tommy John surgery, that he's going to be a guy that's going to work hard. You would think he'll be back sometime. And this is all speculation, people. This isn't something that I'm trying to forecast or predict for Gerrit Cole by any means. But this is one that even with this contract and for the expectations that this player being brought in to take this team to the promised land and to be a guy that was going to carry them into October and still has a little bit to prove when it comes to that, because he hasn't been a lock automatic starting pitcher for the Yankees when it comes to October. But nevertheless, to not have him in your rotation this year, whether it is for a month, 2 months, or obviously the entire year, that is a devastating blow. There's no other way to put it. All right, let me get to the basketball because you got a couple things going on. I'm going to start with college because we're already in the middle of conference championship week. And the first item of note, if you're the Kansas Jayhawks, now I would think you're going to make it to the tournament despite the fact that you're 22-10. You have literally stumbled to the finish line, and last night was indicative of that. Now, granted, you didn't have a couple of players in your lineup, so that's going to be something that you have to keep in mind. But for the Jayhawks to just literally unravel here during the final few weeks of the season, you lose at home to BYU where you had a 12-point lead in the second half. All right, you lose to Baylor and get whacked by Houston. All right, you understand those are two top-ranked teams. And then yesterday to lose to Cincinnati. And even though without the two players in the lineup, but to lose by 20, you're Kansas. This isn't some half-rate or some wannabe organization or wannabe university that is trying to find their way or make their way to be a stalwart or to be a team that is trying to win a championship for the first time forever. This is Kansas. They just won a title 2 years ago. And we understand that not every year you're going to be a team that's going to challenge for a championship despite the fact that you are a blue blood institution. Okay, no ifs, ands, buts about it, but it's almost as if this school has fallen on hard times here. Because how can you go from the pinnacle of winning a championship to the point where you've lost, 8 conference games? You're 22-10. When was the last time Kansas had double-digit losses in a season? Off the top of my head, I can't recall. Whether you're Bill Self, whether you're Roy Williams as the coach, doesn't matter. And for Kansas, I think they're going to make it. Who knows if they're going to be on the bubble, just based on their recent stretch here. But they are not going to be long for this tournament. And that's not going out on a limb by any stretch. But boy, that is alarming, to say the least, how this team has just literally collapsed in front of our very eyes over the last few weeks. And I understand we talked about it on Monday, teams on the bubble, the St. John's of the world, Michigan State. And I should double check that. Didn't Michigan State play last night? So this is going to be fascinating to see where these teams are going to lie here over the course of the next few days as we inch closer to Selection Sunday, which obviously is going to take place later in the afternoon. And the brackets will be filled. Who's going to go where? Who's going to end up in which region, etc. And we'll break it all down there come Monday as we inch that much closer to getting out of the sports dead zone. You could pretty much say that we're out of it considering what had taken place in the NFL here with free agency. But when we get to a week from today, when the tournament will really blossom and everybody's going to be crazed watching wall-to-wall college basketball from 12 noon to about 1 in the morning here on the East Coast, especially Thursday, Friday, and then all the games Saturday, and then Sunday before we get to the Sweet 16. This is where we could finally exhale and get to a point where, with baseball on the horizon, obviously with the madness about to begin, it's pretty much begun there when you look at college basketball. And yes, we could finally wake up out of that slumber from the Super Bowl to pretty much, I'll say Monday, that the Sports Dead Zone is about to skedaddle. Exit stage left or right, whichever direction you want to take it. And college basketball is now going to be front and center here, not only starting today, but pretty much throughout the course of the rest of this month, heading into April, where we'll have the Final Four and then obviously the coronation there with the championship game the first Monday of April. Or really the second Monday, because April Fool's is the first Monday. So April 8th will be your championship game. And let me take a quick look. Michigan State, yes, they'll play Minnesota today. And that's going to be huge because Michigan State is going to have to, I would think at least, if they win the Big 12, they're going to be in. But they would have to go at least to the conference championship in order for me to think that they have a shot to make it into the tournament. And who knows, even if they get to a conference final, it is possible that they could end up being one of the playing games, the first four, next Tuesday and Wednesday. So let's see what's going to happen here over the course of these next few days. And I do want to mention one thing about the women's game. And I would only hope, and people much smarter than me when it comes to their committee, that how they would look at their bracket, you would only hope that they'll put Caitlin Clark in one region, LSU in another, and South Carolina in another region. Now, of course, you're going to have two of them, you would think, on the same side where they will play against one another, because you're not going to have it avoid altogether to where you have them all meeting up, let's say, in a situation where you want to have it in a Final Four. That's my point. You don't want it to be a thing where they face each other in a regional final or they face each other in a regional semi. You want it to where when the dust settles and you look at where the Final Four for the women's side is, you want to have Caitlin Clark in one bracket, LSU in another, and South Carolina in the third bracket. Whomever's in the fourth bracket is whomever. I'm sure you'd want to have LSU, South Carolina to possibly play in a national championship setting. So if that means it's LSU against Iowa or South Carolina against Iowa, so be it. You do not want to see them play anytime before that. And I understand this is all speculation. This is all a situation where if we could have that crystal ball and predict it, that's how we would want it. Of course, anything can happen, injuries, upsets, etc. This is all hypothetical. But if the committee is smart and breaks it down in that way, that's what we would hope for as college basketball fans, to have Iowa, South Carolina, and LSU all in different brackets. Because if they're in the same bracket by any stretch, then shame on the committee for doing so. And I just bring that up now as a receipt because we're going to see on Monday where those teams are going to fall when it comes to the women's side. Speaking of basketball, let me stick with that as I keep my high tops on. NBA, the big story over the last few days is Kawhi Leonard. And we understand that's going to put a damper on their championship aspirations. That is not a shock. That is not anything that's news when we're looking at the landscape of the association at this present moment. But let's call it as we see it. Kawhi Leonard now has a back issue, and we understand backs are cranky, they're bulky, they're unpredictable. It's not an arm injury, it's not a leg injury where, all right, you could tweak it. You need rest. High ankle sprains, as we all know, they are tough to come back from and very unpredictable in their own right. But backs, You could wake up feeling great one day, but you could sleep wrong, and the next day you could be gone for 2 weeks. And with Leonard, we know his injury history. We do not have to go over that. But if he's going to be out for any significant amount of time, that's going to be huge, because I get it, regular season aside, because it's all about what's going to happen in the spring. But you got to be honest. If this is going to crop up here from time to time between now and, let's say, even if they go to an NBA final, it does not bode well for the Clippers. And as they are right now, they are 4th in the West. They're firmly entrenched there because they're 3 games behind and 2 in the loss behind the T-Wolves for 3rd place. And don't look now, who's in 1st place in the West? The Denver Nuggets. But for them to be in 4th, and they are 3 games ahead of the Pelicans there for 4th place, I'm sure that's where they want to stay. Maybe they want to go up to 3 when it's all said and done, because that avoids Denver in a second round matchup if Denver were to stay in the 1st place. But right now, I'm not going to say the NBA, the spotlight is on the Clippers at this present moment, but with Kawhi Leonard out for an indefinite amount of time, and he actually left the arena prior to the end of the game, so it's not as if he hung around. I'm sure he did see some doctors, and maybe he decided that, I'm out of here. Again, we know Kawhi Leonard's going to dance to his own beat, but that is one injury we're certainly going to have to pay big caution and high attention to, because if the Clippers are going to do anything in this postseason, they have to have Kawhi Leonard suit up there if they plan to get to an NBA final for the first time in their franchise's history. And besides that, that is pretty much the biggest item that I could unpack here. Could I talk about Donovan Mitchell coming back to the lineup? Okay, I could do that. Or Luka Doncic, who we talked about there on Monday, had his triple-double streak snapped, where he had those 6 games of 30-point triple-doubles, and even though he left the game with a hamstring, so therefore he was unable to get that streak or extend that streak against the Golden State Warriors in their building last night. But for Doncic, even though with his brilliance, it's all about how far they're going to get in the postseason, and as we would think right now, they could probably get to a conference final, but nothing more than that, and I don't even know if they're going to be able to get that far, if you ask me. So that's what you have there. And even though the Magic extended their coach 4 years, and rightfully so, Jamal Mosley, and the Magic, who have had a very good year under their coach, and who knows what they're going to do here come springtime. They're currently now 5th in the Eastern Conference. So we'll continue to keep an eye on that. And they're, a half game behind the Knicks for the 4th spot. So they will be anywhere in that 4 or 5 range. And who knows, if they get to 4th, they'll have a home court advantage in the first round. And then in the West, like I mentioned about Denver, OKC, they're a half game back. They do have a game in hand against the Nuggets. And everything else is pretty much status quo. I know Phoenix has now fallen out of the 1 through 6 and are in the 7 to 10 range. So you have that. If you're looking at the playoff scenario with the Western Conference, Eastern Conference has pretty much been the same. Heat have now hit a skid here. They've lost 4 in a row. They lost to the Nuggets last night in an NBA final rematch. And I believe didn't they lose to them earlier, just a couple of weeks ago out in Denver. Other than that, that's what you have. Nothing much to even unpack or go into when it comes to the association. So we'll see what's going to happen there over the course of the weekend. Let me see if you have any interesting matchups here with the schedule. And that's why when you get to this point in the NBA season, it becomes a slog. Phoenix is in Boston tonight. Remember, they just played there on Saturday night, so that's a big-time matchup there at TNT. Followed by Dallas at Oklahoma City, so they have a very good doubleheader there. No games on ESPN tomorrow night. LA at New Orleans, so there's your 4 or 5 matchup there as they go at it there in the Big Easy. Over the weekend, your Saturday night showcase, Golden State at LA. I know LeBron will probably play in the game, although he's been nursing that ankle injury. Your doubleheader on Sunday, Phoenix at Milwaukee. And then Denver at Dallas is your 3:30 game. Yeah, those are your games of note here as we head into the weekend with the association. And as far as the NHL goes, to wrap it up as I lace up my skates, I know Matt Rempe got suspended for what? 4 games for an elbow that he threw on the Devil player Monday night, Siegenthaler, and maybe that was a little bit too harsh. The kid has been around, 3 weeks, and he already got a 4-game suspension. I get it that he knocked out Nathan Bastian in a game early on in his young career. That was that first week when he entered the league, as Rempe was trying to make his mark. And we've talked about him a lot here over the past 3.5 weeks or so, but he's going to sit out there. And I know there was a lot of back and forth between Curtis McDermott, the hired gun from Colorado that they got in a trade before the deadline, how he had some things to say about Rempe, saying that he lost some respect, even though he's trying to make his name in the league, young kid, etc. But for him to go high on Siegenthaler, and even though McDermott tried to challenge him as he was on the ice at the time and he wouldn't go, he actually dropped his gloves. Rempe didn't oblige. Rempe waved him off goodbye as McDermott was going off into the locker room. And even though he got a game misconduct, but instead of getting maybe a 1 or 2 game suspension, he got 4 games. I know the Devils and Rangers play one more time. I believe it's April 3rd. So when those two teams, you would think that there's going to be some hell to pay, some retribution. So that's a game to keep on your calendar, at least for the NHL. That's something to look forward to, because for someone like myself, you know me with the tough stuff and sending messages and when rematches are going to take place, that's one I'll have on my radar as that will approach. And I believe April 3rd is the Wednesday, so that'll be the night before my Thursday podcast. So that's something that I'm going to be geeked up and ready to go when it comes to that next matchup. And hopefully both players are in the lineup. But NHL, let's see what I have else to discuss. We could talk about standings. We could go through all that as well, which is pretty much, I would think, not a lot of maneuverability there. Yeah, there's this other story, although this is big. The Thatcher Demko, the goaltender of the Canucks, is going to be out 2 to 4 weeks with a knee injury, and we know the Canucks have had a big year. He's had a lot of wins. I believe he leads the league in wins with 34. So Vancouver, they're going to be fine in the division. They have a pretty comfortable lead. But if you're talking about the 1 seed in the conference, between them and even Dallas, who has played pretty well here, I'm sure they want to have home ice throughout the course of at least the Western Conference. So not having Demko there is going to be a huge loss. There's no other way to cut it. So we will definitely take a look to see where the standings stack out west. Vancouver, they currently have a 3-point lead over Colorado, who they've been hot here as of late. Winners of 5 in a row, tied with Dallas at 89 points, and with Winnipeg just 2 points behind them for the top spot. Over the course of the last 15, 16 games, that's going to be a race to the finish. And Vancouver, like I mentioned, 92 points. They have an 9-point lead over Edmonton, so they should be fine in the division. Although they do have 3 games in hand, Edmonton that is, over Vancouver. So for those who think that maybe Edmonton has a shot to maybe even reach that top seed, they have a lot of work to do, and they've had a great 3 months to get themselves back to at least close to the top spot in the Pacific. But for Vancouver, suffering that loss at this stage of the year, that's one that we certainly are going to have to keep an eye on. But the other thing I want to talk about before I even get to the standings, let me get to the standings real quick. Florida has the most points in the sport, 94, and the most wins, 45. Rangers have played well. Shesterkin has had back-to-back shutouts here over this stretch where he shut out Carolina 1-0 and has played really well. I know Shesterkin he's had a good year. Hasn't had the great year a lot of people expected, although he's had a very hot stretch here. And then on top of that, after that slow start he had, and then the game that I saw live at MetLife in the outdoor series, did not play well in that game, but he certainly turned the season around to where he is peaking at the right time. So the Rangers, they are looking to see if they could be a threat. What do they have? 90 points. Still 4 points behind the Panthers, who right now have the top spot in the East. And when we look at the wild card, we talked about it the other day with the Islanders, but they're going to be in a fight. They are currently still tied. In fact, they played tonight after losing to LA there the other night. They got shut out. Now they play the Sabres tonight before coming home. And even with the Red Wings tied with them at 72 points, Washington 69, it's pretty much been status quo there. And even with the Western Conference, same when you got Nashville and Vegas. Those are the top two spots. St. Louis and Minnesota, 6 points behind Vegas there for the final wildcard spot. And we talked about the divisions there out west with Colorado, Dallas, Winnipeg, as well as Vancouver, Edmonton. You want to throw in LA, that's 6 points behind the Oilers in the Pacific. But that's what you have there with the NHL. But one other thing I want to point out before I bid adieu, and this has to do with the National Hockey League. There's a group in Atlanta that they're requesting an expansion franchise. And it's actually headlined by Anson Carter, the former player, played on a bunch of teams in the NHL. And for this group, it's the Alpharetta Sports and Entertainment Group. Alpharetta is a suburb right outside of Atlanta. I don't know if it's near Cobb County where the Braves play, because remember when the Braves got their new stadium, formerly known as SunTrust or whatever the park, Truist Park as it is now, as they're right outside of the city limits, but could still be deemed Atlanta. But for whatever the reason, they want to bring back an expansion team, which would be for the third time in that area. Remember, they were the Atlanta Flames from, I believe, 1972 to 1980 before going to Calgary. And then there were the Thrashers from, 99 to 2011 before they moved to Winnipeg. And now Winnipeg's having their own issues, as I talked about a few weeks ago. But for this group and this announcement, Top Tier Sports, and as I mentioned, Anson Carter, the former player who is spearheading this attack, to go along with the likes of Peter Simon, Simon Sports, Aaron Ziegler. It's a bunch of players that are trying, not players, a bunch of people that are trying to get this group, Alpharetta, to get the land development, etc. Why would they want to bring back a team to Atlanta is beyond me. You've had two experiments there falter. One was 8 years, the other was 12 years, and now they want to bring a team back to Atlanta again? To upset the balance when you already have, 32 teams as it is in the sport? So now you're going to have a 33rd team where you're going to have to put them probably, I would think, in the Metropolitan Division. Maybe you could put them in the Atlantic. Who knows? But why they're doing this is beyond me. It truly is. And I understand there may be some interest, there may be a bit of a groundswell this time around. But if they swung and missed once, and they swung and missed twice, are they really looking forward to a third strike and really being out when it's all said and done? Now, I understand this is the early stages of this. It's not as if they're going to get a team within the next 2 or 3 years. Who knows? I don't know how much Gary Bettman has been involved with this. I know that, to quote Anson Carter, he says, I've been in dialogue with the NHL commissioner since 2019. So this is 5 years about an expansion team returning to the Fulton County Metro Atlanta market, knowing that franchise decisions are exclusively decided by the Board of Governors. And who knows, would the Board of Governors even approve this, knowing that they've been unsuccessful in 2 go-arounds there in the ATL? I'm bringing it up now because who knows, at some point down the road, I'm going to have to pull out the receipt and unpack this even a little bit further. But I don't know. If it didn't work the first time and it didn't work the second time, why would it work a third time is beyond me. That'll do it, my good people. Another episode just about in the books. As always, thank you so much for stopping by, for carving out precious moments out of your day to listen to what it is I have to say about what goes on in the world of sports. If you haven't done so, please subscribe to my channel at YouTube or on YouTube at JAYREELZ. Any questions, comments, suggestions, hit me up on any of my socials, including YouTube, Instagram, TikTok, and Facebook, the JAYREELZ Podcast. Twitter, X, JAYREELZ1, just the number. The old-fashioned way, the JAYREELZ Podcast at gmail.com. I'll be more than happy to follow up with you guys and gals on whatever it is that's on your mind. Because whether you do or do not know, this is what I love to talk about, people. It's in the blood, it's in the DNA, as I like to say. Of course, go to drinkolipop.com, 15% off by using the code SODALOVE at checkout for your purchase. Full-time content creator, people. I'm not going anywhere as long as I'm alive and breathing. I will continue to deliver the fire, passion, frenzy, you name it. I got it all covered when it comes to sports. This is your one-stop shopping for sports, because where else? What other podcast are you going to get all this in reasonably 1 hour, 60 minutes time frame. Thoughts, opinions, critiques, analysis, praise, feelings on anything and everything. That happens on the world of the diamond, ice, gridiron, hardwood, golf course, racetrack, tennis court, boxing ring, octagon, you name it. From my lips to your ears, from my heart to your soul, from where I am to wherever you are, the JAYREELZ podcast always comes correct, direct, and in full effect. From the South Bronx to South Beach to South Central to South Pacific and all points beyond, peace, love, and God bless everybody. And until next time on the JAYREELZ podcast, on the flip, baby.